Hi, my name is Kate Mackenzie, and today I'll be presenting on schizophrenia. So why are you looking at an umbrella? That would be because it's relevant to schizophrenia. So for schizophrenia at the moment, there is no signature pattern of symptoms or abnormalities that have been identified as reliably and generalizable characteristics of schizophrenia. So therefore, it can be helpful to think of schizophrenia as an umbrella term, encompassing a multitude of disease states under the umbrella category of schizophrenia. So most people associate schizophrenia with hearing voices and delusions or hallucinations. While the positive symptoms of auditory and visual hallucinations and delusions are symptoms of schizophrenia, there are other presenting symptoms of the disease, which includes negative symptoms such as loss of emotional expression, social withdrawal, and avolition, and also that it is a chronic disease and often has poor outcomes in the long term. And you can see some of the more detailed symptoms there in the chart. To further go into detail about the symptoms of schizophrenia, it's possibly helpful to look at the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5. So you've got criterion A, which is the characteristic symptoms of schizophrenia. So these are delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms, which we mentioned earlier in the previous slide, which we'll go into a bit more detail later. So from this category, you need two or more of the symptoms that I just mentioned, each present for a significant portion of time during a 1-month period or less if successfully treated, and at least one of these should include symptoms 1 to 3, so delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. Criterion B, social occupational dysfunction. For a significant portion of time since the onset of the disturbance, one or more major areas of functioning such as work, interpersonal relations, or self-care are markedly below the level achieved prior to the onset of the symptoms. Criterion C, which refers to the duration, continuous signs of this disturbance persist for at least 6 months. This 6-month period must include at least 1 month of symptoms, or less if successfully treated, that meet criterion A, and may include periods of prodromal or residual symptoms. During these prodromal or residual periods, the signs of the disturbances may be manifested by only negative symptoms or by 2 or more symptoms listed in criterion A, present in an attenuated form, and that, for example, is odd beliefs, unusual perceptual experiences. So we've got 3 more criteria from the DSM-5, and their criteria is D through till F. So criterion D, which is schizoaffective and major mood disorder exclusion. Schizoaffective disorder and depression or bipolar disorder with psychotic features have been ruled out because either, number 1, no major depressive or manic episodes have occurred concurrently with the active phase symptoms, or 2, if mood episodes have occurred during the active phase symptoms, their total duration has been brief relative to the duration of the active and residual periods. Then you've got criterion E, which is substance or general mood condition exclusion. So this means that the disturbance is not attributed to the direct physiological effects of a substance, e.g. a drug or medication, or another medical condition. And then finally, we've got criterion F, which is the relationship to global developmental delay or autism spectrum disorder. If there is a history of autism spectrum disorder or other communication disorder of childhood onset, the additional diagnosis of schizophrenia is made only if prominent delusions or hallucinations are also present for at least 1 month or less if successfully treated. So those last few there, mainly to do with ruling out other diagnoses as well. So how is a diagnosis established in terms of schizophrenia? So it's a bit difficult because with schizophrenia, unlike other medical conditions or diseases, you can't just run a blood test. So yeah, there are some scales or tests that are used to identify symptoms. For example, SANS, or the Scale for the Assessment of Negative Symptoms, which assesses the presence of negative symptoms. The SANS has been identified as the rating instrument that provides the most extensive coverage on all of the negative symptoms and is most widely used. So this only really addresses one element of the criteria. The rest of the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, that's going to be identified by a working health professional, so a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and they're going to identify those by observation and relevant definitions included in the DSM-5. So why isn't there a clear diagnostic test for schizophrenia? Why isn't there a blood test or something like that? To understand that, we have to kind of go back and look at the neuropathology of schizophrenia or the schizophrenic brain. So here we can see 2 brains. You've got some twins, they're both 28-year-old males, and you can see that in one brain, the one on the right, the ventricles are quite enlarged. So a meta-analysis done in 2000 and a different one in 2011 confirmed that between patients and controls, there are often larger ventricles in schizophrenia, an increase of about 26%, which is quite substantial, and also a decrease in both grey matter and whole brain volume or brain weight. So thinking about the image we just saw, take a look at this graph at the top left here, which also describes differences in ventricle size between schizophrenic patients and controls. And you can see that ventricles for schizophrenic patients are, generally speaking, enlarged, according to the results of this study. Then you can also see in the graph below, a similar phenomenon has been described in the hippocampi of schizophrenic patients. In terms of other differences reported in various forebrain subregions, there is less consistent results than the areas of which I just mentioned. This lack of consistency in research appears to be a hallmark of schizophrenic neuropathy. When I was researching, it was pretty difficult. There was a lot of contradicting studies, so meta-analysis kind of provided the best sources of information. And this may be that because schizophrenia involves a spectrum of brain network changes that are only unified in the extent to which they are all deviations from the healthy equilibrium. So going back to that idea of schizophrenia being an umbrella term that actually encompasses a spectrum of conditions under the one umbrella of schizophrenia. So you might be thinking, why can't some of this research be used to create diagnostic tools or diagnostic tests for diagnosing schizophrenia in individuals? Well, that's kind of what people are working towards in research. So biomarkers for schizophrenia. You can see on the right-hand side here, you've got a voxel probability map of reliable contributions to major depression versus schizophrenia. So they're looking at dividing up the brain into different areas that will be activated differently by individuals suffering from schizophrenia as opposed to depression. So the researchers were interested in using magnetic resonance image-based markers of schizophrenia and how they can separate patients from healthy controls. So the findings suggested that neuroanatomical information may provide generalizable diagnostic tools distinguishing schizophrenia from other mood disorders in the early course of psychosis. So in the later stages of this disease, or people who've been suffering from schizophrenia for a longer period of time weren't able to be differentiated from depression as easily. Other potential biomarkers are microRNAs. So microRNAs are a small non-protein coding gene. They can be tested by just taking a simple blood test. So there's accumulating evidence that supports these as a key role in neurogenesis, neuronal maturation, and brain development. So the research for this is still in early stages, but there have been promising results that one day you might be able to have a blood test and that will be able to determine whether or not someone can be diagnosed with schizophrenia. So they're just two biomarkers that are currently being researched in terms of further diagnostic tools for diagnosing schizophrenia. There are, of course, many others that I don't have time to mention at the moment. Another thing that I should mention, however, is the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia, which is very prominent. It actually occurs in more than 70% of patients. So significant research over the past 2 decades has substantially elucidated the nature and significant relevance of cognitive impairments in schizophrenia, but cognitive deficits aren't included in the DSM-5, as you would have noticed. So they have been found to not sufficiently distinguish between schizophrenia and other boundary disorders or similar disorders. So in differentiating schizophrenia from other diagnoses using the DSM-5, the information I was able to find actually related to the DSM-4. However, that is or should be still relevant, seeing as the changes aren't very drastic between the DSM-4 and the DSM-5. So the DSM-4 construct of schizophrenia has been found to be clinically useful and has high reliability and fair validity. The DSM-4 schizophrenia has high diagnostic stability, with 80 to 90% of individuals receiving an initial diagnosis of schizophrenia retaining their diagnosis 1 to 10 years later. So in terms of making a clear diagnosis from the DSM-5 and the criteria presented there, something that struck me was the terms hallucination or delusion and other such terms that you could say are subjective. Whilst definitional criteria is provided with the DSM-5, some research has found that the reliability of distinguishing bizarre from non-bizarre delusions has been found to be poor. However, less than 2% of persons diagnosed with DSM-4 schizophrenia receive a diagnosis based on a single bizarre delusion or hallucination. So that's not the only factor that's used to diagnose schizophrenia. So to conclude, there's a mass amount of research on schizophrenia, much more than I've been able to go into detail with here. But a striking difficulty or limitation is that the structural or behavioral characteristics of schizophrenia can't yet completely be confirmed to be defining characteristics of schizophrenia. And so in order to move forward in research and to make strides in learning more about schizophrenia, we are forced to rely on past diagnostic measures that combine individuals with relevant characteristics into one heterogeneous group.